of consensus. So New Zealand First supports the initiative to fix up the loopholes and what this bill intends to do.
Call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's my pleasure to rise and speak on the committee stages of the Administration of Community Sentences and Orders bill. And Labor is obviously supporting this bill. As has already been said, it makes a number of technical amendments and a few policy changes, but predominantly to bills that Minister at the time, I believe Phil Goff, presided over, the Parole Act in particular, and the Sentencing Act in its original form. I do, though, before I get into the detail of the bill, want to make some general statements about the justice area as it relates to community-based sentencing in particular. We've had ministers from that side of the House trumpet for some time now, Mr Chair, that there has been a decrease in reported crimes, that the national government's tough on crime stance has been the cause of this reduction and their much heralded success. Look, the honest truth is, Mr Chair, that actually globally there have been drops in recorded crime, and there's been much interesting debate as to why this global trend has occurred, and some very interesting theories, but there seems to be consensus that it doesn't necessarily come down to the domestic policies of a government, and so that's an interesting contextual point to make. But we do hear in our domestic politics constantly this tough on crime line, both by the government when they were in opposition, but an ongoing sentiment in government. But what changes when they've come into government is the way it's executed. Tough on crime and rhetoric, but suddenly okay with things like home detention, which we're debating today, which at the time, as I recall, when Labor trumpeted the need for these kinds of sentences and community-based sentences, there were some government members who were vehemently opposed to any exploration of those kinds of sentences. And so it seems extraordinary to me that the government maintains this rhetoric whilst actually acknowledging that what Labor has always been is smart on crime. We do what works. We listen to the evidence and the research, and we invest where it's necessary, and we're willing to be bold and courageous and invest in areas like community-based sentencing, because not only because, as Bill English has said, it's a fiscal imperative because the justice sector is costing us so much, because actually you see reduced rates of reoffending when we use methodology like this. And surely the focus should be how do you balance both the need for someone who commits a crime to pay their debt to society, whilst also ensuring that we make the community safer by ensuring that actually we change something for that person's life, both in the way that they're reintegrated but also the way they're rehabilitated. And there are flaws, and I know the Corrections Minister knows this. I know she knows it because she is quietly behind the scenes doing things a little bit differently, but not letting it undermine her tough on crime sentiment. She knows that actually ultimately things have to be done differently if we're to make any gains in this area, and Bill English has even stipulated that. But I also want to highlight, Mr Chair, as I've said, home detention from 2007, 2008, 2008 and 2009, the offenders sentenced to home detention in that period that were reconvicted in the next 12 months sat at around 21% and 23% respectively. And that was less than half that of those relieved from a short-term prison sentence in the same years, where reoffending rates there sat around more like 50%. So not only actually do you see a significant saving for the taxpayer, not only do you see them pay their debt to society by the constraint on their liberty, albeit in a different form than in a formal imprisonment, we actually see the success rate attached to that is much, much better. So there are many reasons why the strategic use of these community-based sentences and things like home detention should be encouraged and used appropriately. But in the face of that kind of evidence, we still see a national government who's inclined to talk about corrections moving more towards a privatised model. You know, we saw this U-turn, this claim that they weren't going to turn existing public prisons into private prisons. They were only going to do it to new builds, but then they did it anyway with the Serco contract at Mount Eden. And that actually sits in direct conflict with what the Minister has been trying to do on the rehabilitation side of things within the justice portfolio. Now, she may claim that groups like Serco have an interest in these areas and can deliver the kind of rehabilitation in the correction system that she's driving for. But the Minister knows that as soon as you drop down in your staffing ratios, the sooner, the less time that you have of prisoners out of cell, the less time that is available for you to offer those programs, it upsets the entire system. The Minister knows that because she also knows that those are the kinds of arguments that are made by prison officers all of the time. That actually properly staffing prisons is a key part of ensuring that we can deliver those much needed programs so that actually we don't just waste time and send someone back into the circle of reoffending. They are inextricably linked with staffing and proper supportive staffing in corrections facilities. And that's something I have no doubt that we will continue to raise with this Minister in the very unsafe environments that I know exist and that corrections officers are exposed to. Coming back to the bill, Mr. Chair, because I mentioned that there are some substantive policy changes, but then also some more technical ones. And I had a couple of questions for the Minister on some of those. I know she'll excuse the fact that I wasn't part of the Select Committee process. One of the changes to the Sentencing Act in particular allows pre-sentence reports for home detention or community detention. It allows offenders are sometimes sentenced to home detention, and that requires an assessment of home circumstances to ensure suitability. There's some changes there. Also, I think it's on post-release where the writing of those reports are handed from probation over to the Chief Executive. I just wondered about capacity to ensure that that handover can be managed properly and ensure that that's happening in a timely fashion. There's also changes that are being made to home detention is cancelled when a subsequent sentence of imprisonment is applied, and a court cannot order that an existing home detention sentence resume once someone leaves prison. And so that's just a common sense change. Again, demonstrates why Labor is in support of these amendments. Also, there's an alignment of electronic monitoring conditions with the range of monitoring equipment. It was something that Chris Farfoy touched on, and I won't traverse that again. But it did make me wonder, Minister, whether or not there were elements where it related to the developing technology, whether or not there was a way that that didn't need to be included in primary legislation, given that there might be ongoing amendments of a technical nature that relate to the technology as it updates, that may prevent us from having to come back to the House in primary legislation to ensure that issues like this are dealt with. I don't know whether or not that was ever feasible, but a question that I would raise. But in that change, it says that offenders may go beyond the boundaries of electronic monitoring equipment without breaching their conditions, because although they may stray from the electronic boundary, they may remain within the residence boundary. This makes it difficult to successfully prosecute. Alongside that, and one of the technical amendments, is the requirement to tell or inform as someone with the community with the home detention sentence of the boundary that they have applied to them, and to tell those who live in the property of the boundary that applies to the prisoner as well. I wondered whether or not there had been cases where you'd been unable to prosecute, Minister, because it was found that they weren't properly informed. Is that one of the reasons now, and to close that loophole, that this is in the legislation? I wondered if there'd been any cases where the combination of those two issues had led to unsuccessful prosecution around breaches of conditions. It was just something I was interested in. It also seems common sense that if someone has a boundary applied to them for home detention, that they would be told about it. But I guess there have been circumstances where that hasn't happened, given that it's now going to be clarified in the legislation. There's a question as well in here around ensuring the integrity of the sentences. Time continues to run on a community-based sentence after an application to vary or cancel the sentence is made. So that means, I believe that if there's non-compliance, that actually the sentence can be put on hold until there's a variation and then it resumes. What kind of time period, I'm not sure the Select Committee members may have had this discussed, the kind of time period that may apply for that variation? I'd be interested to know how long that's suspended for. I'm assuming that they're, of course, required to still comply, but the sentence itself is suspended. So they still have to be compliant during the variation, but they then have to technically fulfil the sentence afterwards. That would be my understanding, but I'd be interested from the Minister to correct me if I am wrong in that sense. Mr. Speaker?
I'm going to call Andrew Little.
Mr. Chairman,